In this video, we're going to look at the approvals system in Scouts RAM. So if we log in as an administrator account and head to the settings menu, you can now see there is an approvals option. So in here, we can set up the approval flows for our group. If no approval flow is specified, then the approval system is not active and no risk assessment will require approval before use. However, in here, we can set up a new approval flow. So if we click on Add New Approval Flow, we can add one of two types. We can either add an approval flow by category or section, or we can add an approval flow which applies to all assessments. If you're using the All Assessments approval flow, then you can only have this one approval flow which will apply to all assessments. If you want different approval flows based on category or section, then you need to use the by category or section type. So in this instance, we're going to set up an approval flow for active games. And the categories, we're going to specify active games. Now we have two options here. We can choose to block the risk assessment from being used until it is approved. So if you set this to yes, then risk assessments which are not approved will not be able to be added to program items and will not be able to be exported to any new locations on OSM. If the risk assessment has already been linked to an OSM section, then changes will continue to sync, but you will not be able to export to any new location until the risk assessment is approved. We can also set it so that any risk assessment that is covered by this approval flow will need to be reapproved if it is changed in any way. So this includes changes to any of the risks within the risk assessment, or if the risk assessment is reviewed. So once you've set up your options, you click Save, and this has now added a new approval flow. We can now set approvers for this approval flow. So we go to the Actions drop down and click on Set Approvers. So if we don't set any approvers here, then the risk assessment will just require approval from one other leader who has edit permissions of that risk assessment. So you can use this if you just want your risk assessment to be checked and approved by another leader before use as a double check. However, you can set specific user levels to approve risk assessments, for example, if you need your risk assessments to be approved by your GSL. So we can go ahead and add a new approval level and give it a name. So in this example, I'm going to set up a 2-level approval where the section leader and then the GSL will need to approve a risk assessment before it becomes active. So this first level, we're going to be the section leader approval. And now we can either add specific users or we can add user groups. So in this instance, I'm going to select the section leaders user group, which has already been set up. So the approval order refers to the order in which approvals need to happen. So approval level 1 will need to be completed before a approval level 2 can then be approved. You can set your approval level to the same number, in which case there is no order in which the approvals need to happen. So for example, if we were to set the section leader approval of 1 and a GSL approval level of 1, then the section leader and GSL will be able to approve in any order, but the risk assessment will still not become active until both have approved. However, in this case, we're going to set section leader approval order of 1. And then we're going to add a GSL approval level of 2. So in this example, the GSL will not be able to approve the risk assessment until the section leader has approved it. Hey, so we have now set up our approval flow, which requires the section leader and then the GSL to approve any risk assessments with the category of active games. So if we now go and look at our risk assessments, you can see that we have a risk assessment under the category of active games. We can now see that the Actions button is red. This means that this risk assessment has not yet been approved and therefore cannot be added to any program event or be exported to OSM. So we can come in and look at the risk assessment. We can now see that under approval, it is approval required. So in this instance, I am the person creating this risk assessment. So I can come in here and click on approval required. And when I'm happy that the risk assessment is ready for approval, I can then click on update and change this to ready to approve. If I want to add any notes, I can do so here, and they will be visible to anyone else in the system. So I've now saved and the status has changed to ready to approve. And now the next level approver, in this case section leaders, will receive an email telling them that there is a risk assessment requiring their approval. So if I now go and move to the section leaders account. So I'm now in the section leaders account, and I can now see that there is one risk assessment to review/approve. And the approval status is awaiting approval. So I can now come in here, I can review the risk assessment, and then I can click on awaiting approval, and it will allow me to update my approval level. So you can either choose to reject or approve the risk assessment. Now, if you reject the risk assessment, we strongly advise that you put in notes giving the reasons why you are rejecting the risk assessment, so that the section leaders can then go back and make any changes. If you reject the risk assessment, then the original creator of the risk assessment will receive an email notifying them that the risk assessment has been rejected and including any notes that you have put. In this case, I'm going to approve this risk assessment. And we can now see that the next level of approval has been completed, and now the GSL will have received an email telling them that there is a risk assessment requiring approval. So if we now go and move to the GSL's account. So I'm now in the GSL's account, and again we have one risk assessment to review or approve. Now this number will only show that you have risk assessment to review or approve if you have permissions to be able to approve that risk assessment. If you don't have permissions to approve the risk assessment, then it will not show in this list. So once again, we can go ahead and review the risk assessment, and then click on awaiting approval, and then choose to either reject or approve the risk assessment. Again, in this case, we're going to approve it. Now, once we click save, we can now see that all approval levels are complete. And if we now look at the status of the approval, it is now approved. And then if we go back to the risk assessments list, we can now see that the actions button is in green, therefore showing that this risk assessment is now approved and active, and we can go ahead and add it to our program or export to OSM. Now, once the risk assessment has been approved, we can now see that it is moved to our active risk assessments list. Now, because this approval flow was set to require reapproval on any changes, if we now go back to our original account that we created the risk assessment under, and go back into the risk assessment. Now, if we were to come in and edit a risk now, we can now see that because we have edited this risk assessment, the approval status has gone back to approval required, and this kicks off the approval procedure again. So again, we now need to come in here and set that the risk assessment is ready to approve, and then click save. And then that is the approval process started again, and once the risk assessment becomes reapproved, it becomes active for use once more. A couple of things to note with the approval system is even if you have permissions to approve a particular level, If you are the creator of that risk assessment, you will not be able to approve your own risk assessment. You will require another leader with the same permissions to approve it for you. And that is how you use the approval system in Scouts RAM.